record this? Recording is in progress. All right, so desktop number 2, share. All right, really quickly, I mean, can you guys see my Rhino window here? Hopefully. So hold on, let me just pull this stuff up here. I gotta pull the chat window up manually or else I won't be able to see it. All right, so at any rate, what I have right now is, I'll turn off the graph here in Grasshopper. But basically the example that I've been working on in front of you guys, right? So here's one of those surface patches, right? I went ahead and put 15 divisions across U and V each. So I have 16 ribs in both directions, right? You can see those laid out and unrolled here, where I've cleaned them up. I've done the curved Boolean to sort of clean up the notches and join everything together. And I've even gone back and added the labels, right, with a single stroke font, really nice size one. Made sure that those are on the blue layer for scoring, right? And so the laser cutter will quite literally sort of like zap U0, this blue line, and then, you know, and score all the information into your sheet. And then it'll come back through afterwards, and then it'll cut a little slower and with more power around the red stuff to cut everything out. Right, so that's how it does scoring versus through cutting. It's just a function of power and speed with the laser. So the faster the laser goes, the less time it has to sort of cut through your material. And then there's the sort of wattage or voltage setting, and so you know, the power as well. So if you speed these things up, then you cut shallower. You make shallower cuts, and that's how you engrave and score and things like that. Right? Okay, so that's what I have here, right? A bunch of ribs starting at U0 all the way to U15 and V0 all the way to V15, I think, all the way over here. I think I have all these labeled. Yeah, all right. So 16 ribs, they start counting at 0, so it goes from 0 to 15 instead of 1 to 16. Kind of weird, right? The reason I kept that labeling is because if I go to my 3-dimensional version, right, that the Rhino script gave me of these ribs, right? So in other words, it built these ribs 3-dimensionally before laying a flat version of them out on the XY plane for us for laser cutting, right? So I just want to go, come on, I just want to blow up my perspective view. I don't know why it's taking a minute, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow up that perspective view, and I'll start selecting these things. I'm going to look at the properties box here. And what you'll notice is, if I go to properties, right? So, you know, layers, render settings, materials, and we have properties, right? That sort of color wheel. If I start to select one of these ribs, right, these 3-dimensional ribs, they're actually named, right? So we actually named them in Rhino. So this is V15, right? And so what you can do is you can find where the let's see, the V0 is, and then this one is going the opposite direction. So that's U15. So if I turn it over to this corner, I have V0 and U0, right? So this is U0, the first U rib. This will be U1, U2, U3, U4, V1, V2, V3, all the way to 15 across, right? And so right away, what I recommend is to have your laptop and your Rhino model up, so that you can reference this and turn it the right way, and then you can basically have the digital version right behind your analog version as you're putting this together. And so you know, what's really interesting is that there was a time for a while where you know, digital models were fairly new, in particular BIM models. So you would always show like the sort of before the BIM photo, or like the BIM screenshots of the geometry, and then the after, like the post-construction photos, just show how well they match up, right? So you could do something similar here. Here in a little bit, next week, starting next week, we'll actually make an sort of exploded axon assembly drawing of this, right? So let's say you flat pack this and sold it like, and someone bought it like they would a piece of furniture at IKEA. It would come with those IKEA instructions for, you know, figuring out which piece is which, laying them out, and then you know, slotting them together, right? So we'll actually do those drawings starting next week, all right? But for now, if you need it and you don't have one of those drawings, you know, we're just going to use these models to generate those drawings with some Make 2D magic, right? So You can certainly use this. And again, I'm just in the properties box over here. Every time I select one of these ribs, it gives me a name, right? It gives me the label V0, right? V1, V2, V meaning one direction, one of the directions for the ribs, and U meaning the other direction, right? So, all right. So now we get to, I'm going to open up my Grasshopper graph again. We get to the componentry, right? These shading components. Right? And so now the question becomes, if I look over here, let's say this starting one, let's say this is A1, right? This label, if I zoom in on it, let's say this is A1, right? Which corner on the digital model does A1 start at, right? That was a question I think a few of you had for me already. And it's a good question, right? Now, you can see, sometimes, I'll just turn this off for a moment. Sometimes you can see that this corner is dramatically different than this corner, and you can visually sort of see which one that might be, right? But that's not always the case. And in fact, even if you think you can make that assumption, I would maybe just double check things using the following steps. First of all, both of the surface patches you're working with are, for all practical purposes, symmetrical, right? So this one is really close, if not the same as this one. And this one over here in this corner is really close, if not the same to this one over here. All right, so keep that in mind. But what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and turn on the Grasshopper graph. Okay, there's a couple different ways I can do this. I can go to the joined set over here right before I unroll them, right? And look, I have a big, looks like a big data tree, right? And so I just want to sort of understand what the first one of these is, right? And I want to highlight it in green, right? You can see it. You can see when I select this widget, it highlights everything in green, right? But I just want to highlight the first item in this big data tree as green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the geometry, or sorry, go to the sets tab. I'm going to go to the lists, right? I'm going to say retrieve a specific item from a list. Okay. I'm going to plug this data tree in. Okay. And then where I plug it in for the L for the list to use, right now I'm plugging in a data tree. And so I want to flatten that data tree into a list. So I'm going to flatten that data tree. I'm going to right click where I'm inputting the data tree and that L input. And the menu that pops up is going to let me flatten that input into a list. And now when I just select this, I'm just going to have one item in here. It's going to be the very first item in this sort of flattened list of components. I can see which corner is highlighted green, right? And so that's A1, right? That is A1. And now if I go back to the Rhino model and I select this, I can say, okay, this is where V0 and U0 intersect, right? So where V0 and U0 intersect, that's the A1 cell. And then I can go back to this list widget, and right now I have an item index of 0. That means I'm finding just the first item in that list. If I want to find the second item, I can change this index by right-clicking on the I for index input and set integer, and I can change that 0 to 1. Right? Now when I select this, I'm going to see what the second one is, the A2. All right. Okay, and so this is A1, this is A2, this is A1 again, right? So this will be B1 and C1 and D1. So they'll step up by numeral in this direction, and they'll step up by lettering in this direction. All right. And if you can, again, quickly jot that down, draw it out, or just keep this in front of you while you're putting this together, right? Again, it's one of those things where you can always reference it back and just double check for some quality control as you go. All right, but that's one way you can begin to think about this, right? So if I wanted to just double check that again, I could just go back to the unrolled versions, right? Let's say right here, I can plug those in. Yeah, and let's just double check. This is going to show us what the second one in the unrolled version is. Maybe. Find my curve. Find my curve. Let's see what we have here. what do we have here? I have 900 and there's 4 each. Oh, okay. Interesting. So these are all individual line segments. Are they grouped together or not? So one of the things I'm going to do, and really quickly, what I'm noticing is that for these naked curves, the sort of edge curves, the through cuts, the sort of defining the overall shape of each of these components, right? It's basically broken them up into each four edges broken up. And so what I'm going to do, maybe really quickly, I'm just going to, for my purposes here, I'm going to join these together. Let's see if I can find join curves here. So I went to the curves tab, right? So when I'm going to do something with curves, either make curves or query them or join them or explode them or whatever, I go to the curves tab, right? I mean, I think that's intuitively obvious at this point, but it's worth maybe saying out loud just in case, right? So I can plug these in. Let's see. Yes, now I have 225 closed curves. All right. So, okay. And so I thought wrong, right? What's interesting is that as I move across in this direction, right? So this is A1, this will be B1, right? Because I used the second, I'm seeing with the second item in the list here and it's B1, right? So again, these might actually be upside down the way you're doing these, and that's fine. You just want to make sure that you sort of understand which one's which, and then so you fold them and you match up the edges. But you want to make sure that you're going in the right direction and you're matching up each component in the correct cell. Okay, so that's essentially what I did. So what I said is the first one in the big long data tree three-dimensionally is here, and the second one is here, right? So then I compared it to the flattened versions, and the first one is here and the second one is there, right? So let me just zoom out here so you can see it a little better and draw this with a non-red or green line so you can actually tell where I'm drawing versus what's Grasshopper stuff. So this one is this one. But then this one, oh, why did I do that? Come on, Zoom. I don't think they made Zoom with architects in mind, is this one, right? And so the third one would be C3, going this way, right? So again, just making sure that as you lay these things out, right, that you confirm where A1, B1, C1 versus A1, A2, A3, which direction those are going, right? And that's one way you can do it. Another way is you could bake these components in, right? So I could bake all of these into my Rhino model, for instance, if I really wanted to. Let me just clear this out. And then what I could do is I could type in unroll in Rhino. Is it still trying to bake or something? No, what's going on here? Okay. So if I type in unroll surf, explode, no, labels, sure, right? But then let's say I want to just unroll this, flatten this out, right? I can unroll it and I can compare it to see if it's this corner or this corner, right? And so I might need to rotate this about, but I think it's very, very, again, intuitively obvious to even the most casual observer that this one is over here and it's not one of these triangles, right? So then suddenly you sort of have, again, another three-dimensional sort of idea, right? And what's interesting when you use the Rhino unroll, just the native one, it tells you where the edges go. So this is edge 0, this is edge 2, right? So 0 and 2 are the ones that go, right? This one and this one are the edges that go along that attach to the grid shell, right? And this is the apex peak that's sort of projecting, poking outwards, right? As this thing gets folded up. All right, so there's more than one way to do this, right? And so in particular, I just want to bring this up for everybody and for your benefit. But in particular, if you're having issues with this and you're going to be laser cutting soon, then bring this up to me sooner rather than later. All right, and that's exactly what I just wanted to sort of begin to address today. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and stop recording.